I'd like to take a moment just to think about what I think in the end of our lesson hopefully will be an encouraging thought. But when we get to 1 Samuel chapter 31, we read something that is incredibly sad. It's about the end of Saul's life. The end of Saul's life did not go very well. He died a jealous and envious king who was deposed by God. Eventually, David would replace him after he died. And we read about it in 1 Samuel chapter 31, verses 5 and 6. It says in verse 5, when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. And so Saul, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men died together that same day. You go on in verse 8, it says, and so it happened the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. And then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. It's a pretty humiliating death for a king. He's shot by the Philistines and eventually kills himself because he doesn't want the embarrassment of having been killed by a Philistine. His 3 sons die that day as well. He is beheaded, and then his body is fastened to a wall by his arch enemies to show off the fact that he's been killed. That's a humiliating death, especially for someone who dies at the hand of his enemies and the enemies of God's people. But I want you to notice something in verses 11 through 13. It says, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and traveled all night, and they took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh, and they burned them there. And then they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So what's interesting to me is that these men of Jabesh Gilead, despite the fact that Saul ultimately dies, not a successful king, dies in humiliation, these men come and they give Saul a proper burial. And when you read that and you think about all the things that Saul did to really waste his time as king, you wonder why. Why would they have done that? And I think the answer goes all the way back to 1 Samuel chapter 11. You've got to turn back about 19 chapters. And at the beginning of Saul's reign, not everything Saul did was bad. Saul actually does something good at the beginning of his reign in chapter 11. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 11, I want you to remember what had happened, or at least what was threatened to the men of Jabesh Gilead here in 1 Samuel chapter 11. It says, then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, make a covenant with us, and we will serve you. And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, on this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I might put out all your right eyes and bring reproach on all Israel. That sounds like a good deal, right? We'll make a deal with you as long as I can put out the right eye of each of your men. And the elders of Jabesh said to him, hold off for 7 days. So we need some time to think about that we may send messengers to all the territory of Israel. And then if there is no one to save us, we will come out to you. So the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and told the news in the hearing of the people. And all the people lifted up their voices and wept. And you can imagine, this is a terrible deal. We're all going to lose our right eye. And there was Saul coming behind the herd from the field, and Saul said, what troubles the people that they weep? And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. And then the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard this news, and his anger was greatly aroused. He took a yoke of oxen, he cut them in pieces, he sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came with one consent. When he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000. The men of Judah were 30,000. And they said to the messengers who came, "Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you shall have help." And the messengers came and reported it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. And therefore the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do with us whatever seems good to you." And on the next day, Saul put the people in 3 companies. They came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch, and they killed the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered, so no 2 of them were left together. See, years before, when Saul was king and was beginning his king, Saul did something good for the people of Jabesh Gilead. He saved them. He rescued them from what would have been humiliation for their people. Cutting out and taking out Uriah would have been humiliating. So despite Saul's bad reputation at the end of his life, by the people of Jabesh Gilead at least, he is remembered for good. And I want to think about that concept with you just in light of what Jesus says in just one verse in Luke chapter 6 and verse 38. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 38, in Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says here, "Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you." Saul had done something good for the people. He had made a sacrifice, rallied up the troops, as was his job. He was filled with righteous anger. He protected his people, which was his job, and he'd rescued them. And these people, even though that had happened years ago, remembered that and gave Saul and his sons a proper burial in honor and in remembrance of what Saul had done for them. Sometimes when we're trying to do good, we sometimes wonder about if it will ever be remembered, if it will ever be paid back. I don't think that was ever Saul's thought, Saul's concern in 1 Samuel chapter 11. He did something good because it was the right thing to do. He gave and he sacrificed because it was the right thing to do. And eventually it came back to him. Likewise, Jesus says to us that if we will give, if we will serve, and if we will sacrifice, that at some point in time, when it's our turn, when we're the ones who are in need, it will be given back to us. And so we give without expecting anything in return, but yet with a promise that when there is a need on our behalf, it will be returned. One of the things that God has done for us is that God has given. He gave us his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And what he asks of us is that we would also give. And there is great reward. There is great reward for those who give. At this time, if you're someone who just needs to be motivated by these words, I encourage you to take these words and go live them in your life. Give, help, serve. There's a great blessing that will come when you give. And if you're not a believer yet, realize that you have someone, God, who was given the greatest gift to you, the blood of his Son, so that you could be saved. And that opportunity that we have every time we meet together, we offer you this invitation. So that if you haven't yet believed in him and put your faith in him and obeyed him, you can be saved this very night.